Welcome to Kaukauna Public Library. My name is Gavin Schmitt. I'm the local historian here at Kaukauna Public Library. This is a program on fur trading in the early 1800s, specifically with John Lawe. If the name John Lawe sounds familiar, it may be because the whole north side of Kaukauna has a street called Lawe Street, and that is named after him. Who is he? Why is he important? So John Lawe was the nephew of another man named Jacob Franks, and Jacob Franks was a fur trader who came down from Canada and set up in Green Bay. John Lawe followed in his uncle's footsteps. Jacob Franks went back to Canada, but John Lawe stayed in the Green Bay, Kaukauna, roughly that area his whole life. The boundaries weren't as well defined back then. He briefly spent some time at Mackinac Island in his youth, but by 1797, he was already in Green Bay. So this is, more than 50 years before statehood, quite a while back. He started out working as a clerk for the local fur company. He spent the next few winters trading with the Indians in the region between Green Bay and the Mississippi River. During the first winter, he was trading with the Ho-Chunk around Fond du Lac. He was working under Louis Beaupre, and I may be saying that wrong, my French is terrible. Lawe later reflected, "I was very wild and boyish in them times, very well that I did not care for anything." So he was just a young man out there in the woods having fun. In 1805, he acquired land from his uncle and constructed a sawmill and a grist mill. For several years, he traded independently and sometimes joined other traders in the Mackinac Company or the Green Bay Company. All these fur companies have really generic names. There's like Northwest Company, Southwest Company, American Fur Company. So it's hard to keep them straight. It doesn't matter for this presentation. He did eventually become a trader for John Jacob Astor, who was by far the largest fur trader. Well, I don't even know if he fur traded, but he owned fur trading companies in the United States. He was ridiculously wealthy. Possibly the richest man in the country at the time. Lawe later reflected, "In the year 1805, I was a-going to the Missouri with Mr. James Aird for 3 years, but as it happened, I came back to this place the next spring," this place being Green Bay, "as the government of the United States would not allow me to go into the Missouri, as I was a British subject." Aird was a trader in Prairie du Chien who knew Jacob Franks and Robert Dixon, and that's why he hired Lawe on as a clerk to travel on to North Dakota. He wasn't allowed to go to North Dakota, as he just said. Had he done so, he would have crossed paths with Lewis and Clark, the great explorers, because the rest of the team did cross paths with them. It's worth stopping here to note that he said that he's a British subject. Coming down from Canada, he would be British, because Canada at this time was British. And it's interesting to understand how Wisconsin was in those times. I think we generally think in history that America was started out on the East Coast and worked its way west, and America spread to the Middle West, and then the mountains, and then eventually California and Alaska and beyond. There were people here before the Americans got here. Obviously the Indians were here, but the British were in the area, the French were in the area. So there's actually a lot of thriving activity going on in Wisconsin well before it was part of America. So the British were here. The British had a fort in the Green Bay area. So the earliest real settlement in Green Bay is British. It's not American. All right, which actually brings me to the War of 1812. So the War of 1812 was from 1812, obviously, to 1814, and it was the British against the Americans. More or less, it was sort of a fight over the border of Canada and the United States. Well, in the War of 1812, John Lawe is British, so he sides with the British. And in fact, not only was he British, but the Greenough family, who is very famous around here, and Jacques Porlier, again, my French is terrible, they all worked for the British. They were commissioned as British officers. So during the War of 1812, Northeast Wisconsin actually fought on behalf of the British, not the Americans. So Interesting to think that where we are right now, at least where I am right now, this was a British territory. This was the British defending against the Americans. Ultimately, the Americans won the War of 1812, which created some problems for John Law, because following the war, the law was passed saying that British traders could not work in the United States. It said, hey, we just fought a war against you. We don't really want you anywhere here trading with the Indians. And as the land slowly spread out to Wisconsin and Minnesota and the Dakotas and beyond and became American territory, the British could not trade there anymore. Well, John Law had spent basically his entire life in Green Bay, and he was like, well, I don't know anything else. I don't want to go to Canada, which I don't really know. I don't want to go to England, where I've never been in my whole life. So he wanted to keep fur trading. So he came up with this clever ruse where he would hire on another man, and the man's name was Mr. Lawrence. I don't know what his first name was, but Mr. Lawrence, who was an American, and he put the company in Mr. Lawrence's name while he had himself on the books as an interpreter. In reality, John Law was still running his little fur trading company, but on paper, an American was running the company, and he was just an interpreter because he already knew the locals. So he skirted the law. Now, of course, people knew he was doing it, and they weren't really happy about it, but according to the way it was laid out, he was following the law. People were getting their furs confiscated by the local authorities. In this case, it would be the military. There wasn't a police force yet, so the military would enforce the laws. Ramsey Crooks, who, again, if that name sounds familiar, it's because the whole south side of Kaukauna has a street named Crooks Avenue, is named for Ramsey Crooks, another big fur trader. He wrote to John Law in 1817, shortly after this law was passed. He goes, I hope you have passed a pleasant and prosperous winter. I am sorry to hear of Mr. Poirier's bad fortune, but I trust you will nevertheless make out pretty well. Wonders you cannot expect to do. Hoping to have the pleasure of seeing you here at an early date. Now, what he's referring to is Jacques Poirier. He's been repeatedly stopped by the military and had his furs confiscated. So he'll work for months at a time collecting his furs to bring back and trade in Canada. And every time he starts going to Canada, the military stops him and takes his stuff. So he gets deeper and deeper in debt, because the way the fur trading would work is at the beginning of the season, they would get all their supplies from their company in Canada on credit, and they would then go get the furs, and they'd get enough furs that they could pay back their debts and make some profit on top of it. Well, when he's not getting any furs, he's not making any profit, but his debts don't go away. So Poirier is getting worse and worse off. John Law is kind of skirting by. They saw that the authorities saw that this was sort of a problem, and it wasn't necessarily fair to the people who were already there. They were like, well, when we intended to kick people out, it was sort of the idea we didn't want more people moving in, not necessarily that we didn't want people already there to stop what they were doing. This would depend, who was in charge. At this time, it was Governor Cass, and Governor Cass was very lenient about that. So he started saying, we should give out more licenses to foreigners, in this case, foreigners being the British. And Louis Greenough was actually against this, even though that would be in his favor, because he was afraid if they got too loose, there would be as many traders as houses. They actually were running deeper and deeper into debt, even when they could get licenses. Sometimes they had trouble getting licenses renewed. They were constantly encouraged to apply for citizenship, and then they'd apply for citizenship, and that would get held up because people were like, you fought for the British in the War of 1812. Why do we want somebody who fought against us to be a citizen? It doesn't make any sense. So they couldn't really win. They couldn't get their licenses. They couldn't get their licenses renewed if they did get their licenses, and they couldn't get their citizenship because they were seen as the enemy. They did eventually manage to get their citizenship. John Law got it, Pierre, Augustine, Charles Greenough, they all got their citizenship. Augustine and Charles Greenough are the same. Augustine and Charles Greenough that you may know from the Greenough Mansion in Kaukauna. So they became American citizens in 1819. Prior to that, they were considered British citizens. Around this time, Fort Howard is growing. Fort Howard was the military base by Green Bay. And they expanded to create a second fort called Camp Schmitt. And Camp Schmitt, they built on land owned by John Lawe. So John Lawe actually made out really well here. Even though he started to lose money fur trading, he made money by selling his land to the government to use as a fort. He then also started a partnership with Jacques Porlier, Pierre Greenough, Augustin Greenough, Louis Greenough. And the idea was if one of them lost money, the others would then balance it out. They would all profit share. If one of them did a great job, they would all share in that. And if one of them did poorly, they would all share in that. So nobody would be worse off than the others. It was a really good idea, but it also ran them into trouble because there were rival traders out by the Mississippi. A man named Joseph Rolette by Prairie du Chien was notoriously against the Green Bay traders. He worked with the Sioux. Most of the people in the Green Bay area worked with the Menominee, but Rolette worked with the Sioux, and he would actually send Sioux raiding parties to these trading posts that the Greenoughs had out in the middle of nowhere, and they would have them steal things from them, burn them down, what have you. So it was actually a constant fight just to be able to sell goods. It's interesting to know that they were burning each other's businesses down. That's how serious this was to them. John Lawe was gaining in popularity in Green Bay, gaining in prestige. He was actually quite wealthy because of his land sales, and he was appointed a judge. So he became a judge in 1822, and he started trying to use his authority to plot more land. He plotted a place called Menominee, which never officially became a city. Now it's part of Green Bay, but it was never actually called Menominee. It was just something he drew up on paper. In 1834, John Jacob Astor retired, and as he retired, he wanted everybody to pay their debts to the company so he could get paid out in his retirement. Of course, everybody is in great debt to the fur company because fur trading is starting to go downhill at this point. It's becoming too competitive. There's too many people out there doing it, and the money just isn't there anymore. So they made an arrangement where Lawe would transfer some of his land to John Jacob Astor in exchange for the debts. And even after this, he still owed the company $8,000, which, I mean, I don't know what $8,000 in the 1830s would be today, but it's an unthinkable amount. I wouldn't be surprised if it was $1 million or more today. It's just a huge debt. Lawe became an associate justice for Brown County. He was also elected to the Legislative Council for the Wisconsin Territory. Before Wisconsin became a state, it was a territory for a few years. It doesn't look like he really had much of an impact sitting in the legislature. It looks like almost every single time he voted with the majority. He has no opinions on the record whatsoever. There's no record of him ever making a speech in government. So it looks like it was just sort of like an honorary thing. Hey, you get to be, an assemblyman. And then he just like, well, how does everybody else want to vote? Okay, I'll vote the same. He didn't really have strong opinions one way or the other. Relations between Lawe and Crooks became strained. They became strained to the point where they could no longer be friends, and this all came out of business problems. Crooks was the representative for the fur company, for Astor's Fur Company, and Lawe still had these debts. And unfortunately, he also had a bad habit of selling goods to local settlers, white settlers, on credit. And the problem with that is, although that made him a lot of friends with the settlers had a tendency to settle in Green Bay for a year or two and then move on to the Dakotas or move back, to New England. So they would say, well, I'm not going to pay my debts, and they just got up and left. So all these debts that people had to John Lawe, he wasn't getting paid, which only increased his debts to the fur company yet again. He was a co-founder of the Fox River Hydraulic Company in 1836, as well as the Howard Fire Insurance Company in 1841. As part of this, they constructed a dam across the river, the Fox River, near De Pere. I think this has got to be one of the earliest attempts to do so. This was prior to any of the canals or any of that. So John Lawe was really kind of a pioneer there. He also sat in and helped with translations and negotiations during the Treaty of the Cedars. And the Treaty of the Cedars happened in 1836. It was between the Menominee and the Americans. And there's a marker just outside of Little Chute where it happened. If you haven't stopped there, you should stop there. It's close by, it's easy to find. But during this agreement, the Menominee Nation ceded to the United States 4 million acres of land for $700,000. 4 million acres is hard to picture, but it's anywhere from here out to Stevens Point, all the way up to Wausau. It's basically all of northeast Wisconsin. So it's huge. This should be considered a bigger deal. I mean, it's a marker in Little Chute, but I don't think a lot of us are taught about it. But really, Wisconsin as we know it exists because of this treaty. All of this became Wisconsin land in this one act. For his part in negotiations, Lawe was paid $12,000. Augustin Greenough was paid $10,000, and Jacques Porlier was paid $7,000. So the people who were negotiating and translating got very well compensated for this, on top of the fact that the United States got a huge chunk of land. And Lawe was very friendly with the natives. He would write in letters that my house is a complete thoroughfare for them. There is some time that I cannot stir about. All my house is so full. I furnish them provision, lading, fuel, and I reap no benefit by it. I have been so long in the country amongst them that they look up to me as their old friend and thus think it is due them. At the time that Colonel Stambaugh, I don't know who that is, was here the last year, the smallpox had got among the Indians, and they all came here from different places far and near to get vaccinated, and they all came to my house as usual. He expanded his business holdings. He even started mills around the area of Two Rivers. So he not only was in the Green Bay area, he was also further out by Manitowoc and Two Rivers. He finally lost contact with his superior fur companies in 1839, which, based on all these other business ventures, probably wasn't that big of a deal, but Ramsey Crooks wrote to him, "We would prefer to close all our affairs in your quarter, and shall be pleased to hear that you have made better arrangements for your own interest than those that have recently existed between us, for we have only continued under the impression that it was for the advantage and convenience of an old and much esteemed friend, not for the sake of the profit the business gave us." This is a very polite way of saying, we've continued to extend you credit for years because you've been with us so long, but we're losing money on you and we're getting kind of sick of it. So Ramsey Crooks was already no longer Lawe's friend, but he was polite in his business letters. This was sort of the last straw where he's like, even on a business basis, we're not going to work with you anymore because you just keep digging yourself deeper and deeper in the hole, which is not what we want to do as a business. Towards the end of his life, Lawe wrote, he said, "I'm not a hypocrite. I don't go to church and put on a long face and pretend to be a very religious person, and at the same time, to try and pick my neighbor's pocket. I defy the world to say that I have ever injured my fellow creature. I am humane and charitable more than my means allow me, and have been so all my lifetime. It is true I talk sometimes with others about people, but it is merely for talk's sake. I don't think any more about it." It's interesting to note here that he sort of talks about not going to church. There really wasn't a church to go to. For the people in the fur trading, I mean, unless there was a Roman Catholic priest who was wandering through the area, there weren't really options for religious services. There weren't really churches to go to of any denomination. There weren't priests or pastors. The strange thing here is John Lawe, his mother was actually Jewish, but they converted to Catholicism because there was just nowhere in the frontier to be Jewish. So he was Catholic, but not really, he wasn't very strongly Catholic because he just did it because it was the only religion around. So he had really no strong beliefs in that one way or the other, which of course gets him criticized from others. A missionary who came through writes a letter. He goes, "John Law has left a large family of children by an Indian wife. She died some years since. Her children are papists," and papist means Catholic. "He has utterly neglected religion himself. His friends now look upon him as having died a good Catholic. The amount of his religion consisted in this: he expressed a wish to be buried beside his wife. This he could not be unless he was baptized." So he did get baptized in his final days, just so he could be buried in a Catholic cemetery along his wife. But he never really was a strong believer one way or the other. Which, again, this may be due to the fact that he was spending so much time with the natives. So he kind of saw their way of living as well. Went through that pretty quickly. There's a whole lot more. You can't probably see this from this angle, but I have 86 pages of notes I've taken on John Law. There's not a book on him, which shocks me, but I was able to make 86 pages of notes. So there's certainly stuff out there if anybody wanted to write a book on one of the most important men in Northeast Wisconsin history. They probably should. I'm not qualified to do it, but if somebody else wants to, that would be great. One final thing before I go is a friendly reminder that the Fox Cities Book Festival is coming up in a few weeks, and one of our guests is a man named Robert Silbernagel, and Robert wrote a book on the Cadats, who were another fur trading family. They were up in northwest Wisconsin, sort of like kind of the Superior area on Lake Superior, specifically on Madeline Island, if you're familiar. And he will be here, and he will talk about fur trading in that region. And there, instead of with the Menominee, they traded with the Ojibwa. So it'd be interesting to see how things differed depending on which tribes the fur traders were dealing with. I don't know much about that myself, so I'm pretty intrigued. I hope you're there. It's great to support the authors when you can, and it's free. So see you then.